And then when I think about men who have followed a couple times in Kizomba, it's very performative. It's like, hey, I'm able to do this cool thing. And they're all instructors and are incredibly, incredibly talented. And I have never seen a beginner male follow, and I've never seen a beginner female lead. And I'm just like, where do these people come from? They just magically manifest somehow in the scene. So like, I want to learn how to lead. I've started to learn how to lead, but it's very intimidating and there's not space for it. And that's like with my white privilege as someone who's straight, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
I'm curious, what have you found is like the most effective way to kind of to break the stigma around roles and get people to be open to shifting?
Well, I mean, part of it has to do a lot with language, just using the terms like lead and follow versus men and women, and it makes a huge difference. And that can also be very culturally embedded as well. Like I went to a congress, so congresses are like these like big weekend-long dance festivals, and I had an instructor who was visiting from another country, and he was like, men on this side, women on this side, and one of my friends who's a woman knew what he meant, and she wanted to lead, so she went to the men's side, and he like harassed her. He was like, oh, you're a man? Like, oh, and he teased her for the rest of the class, and obviously that's incredibly problematic for many reasons. Like, she could have been trans, like there's so many other aspects embedded in that, and luckily she was like very sure of herself and was able to stand up for herself. But I can just imagine if it was someone at the beginning of their dance journey or at the beginning of their gender journey or social justice journey, that could totally deter them and be like, I'm never going to leave again, which is super sad. I see that there's a question here or a comment from Liz Allen. This is incredible work, being a dancer myself and a beginner in Latin dancing. This is so prevalent. I have friends who happen to be gender fluid and both lead and follow, and the general public isn't comfortable with it. What you're doing is so important. Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate it. Yeah, the idea of people who lead and follow equally, very rare, quite frowned upon. And it sucks. If you look at communities like swing, that's much more common, but not in Latin dance, unfortunately.
All right, well, thank you so much, Lexi. That was great.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone's comments and feedback, and please feel free to reach out anytime.
If you want as well, you can put your information in the chat. So throughout then we can add.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I will stop sharing. There we go.
All right. And yeah, now we can move on to the next presentation if you all are ready.
Awesome. So we are going to be talking about diversity in bystander intervention programs. We can start with introductions. My name is Mary Takgbajoua. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm from DePaul University. I'm interested in research on sexual violence because it's very prevalent and traumatic, and I'm interested in bystander intervention in particular because it focuses on preventing sexual violence rather than treating outcomes of it.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Greeson. I'm a faculty member at DePaul University in the clinical and community psychology programs. And I've been evaluating DePaul's bystander intervention program for over 5 years now.
Hi all, my name is Peggy and I am a graduate student at DePaul University. I'm interested in gender-based violence overall because, again, as Mary said, it's so prevalent and I think so uniquely affecting for so many populations. And I'm interested in bystander interventions because I think throughout the literature we see many populations, particularly marginalized populations, that don't really want to seek out formal resources, but want to find community-based solutions to these issues. And I think bystander interventions are one of those. community-oriented solutions to this problem.
Awesome. So if anyone has any experience with bystander intervention, feel free to drop that in the chat. And then Megan is going to go over some rules and guidelines for our discussion.
Yeah, so today we'll be talking about issues related to diversity and bystander prevention of sexual violence, with a particular focus on universities as the sites where this is occurring. In particular, we'll be talking about diversity related to race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexuality. So just some guidelines for our discussion. Gender-based violence prevention and its intersections with race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation are very complex issues, and we've only got 25 minutes, so we won't be able to get to everything, of course. We also ask that people speak from their own experiences and not for others as we're discussing these topics. Furthermore, when people share their experiences of feeling excluded and oppressed, our job is to be here for them, to care for them, and believe them, not invalidate or question their experiences. And I'd also like to ask us to remember to make space for everyone to have a chance to share in this discussion. And then finally, our identities will be relevant to this discussion. And so folks are more than welcome, but absolutely do not have to share their identities and how they relate to their ideas about this topic. Take it away, Mary.
All right, so sexual violence is a major problem in America, especially on college and university campuses. Women are 5 times more likely to experience sexual violence if they're a college student, and an estimated 25% of women and 7% of male college students in the US have been sexually assaulted, although these numbers only reflect cases that have been reported and are probably higher in actuality. One way that colleges and universities have attempted to combat these high numbers of sexual violence is through the use of bystander intervention trainings. These trainings recognize that third parties frequently witness sexual or relationship violence or scenarios that condone such violence, and these trainings teach people to intervene in these situations.
Great. So bystander intervention programs are one of the most common strategies for sexual assault prevention in college campuses, extremely popular and recommended as best practice by the national government. How exactly that's implemented, though, varies from university to university. So pre-COVID, a lot of them were done in person. Sometimes they've also been done online. The one I have the most deep experience with at DePaul is a 3-hour-long workshop. And so in that workshop, they teach students, didactic information, lecture kind of stuff about what does it mean to intervene as a bystander if you see a situation at risk for sexual violence, why that's important. They discuss potential barriers to why someone might not intervene if they witness one of those scenarios. And then they also practice role playing, where they're given some scenarios to choose from, and then they have to act out. If you saw this scenario that's suggesting it's about sexual violence is about to occur, how would you intervene as a bystander? So that's the basics of the intervention.
Previous research on bystander intervention trainings is pretty consistent in showing that women typically have greater bystander attitudes, intentions, and behaviors when compared to men. But research on the effects of race and ethnicity and LGBTQ status has been mixed and sometimes inconsistent. For example, some studies have found that Black participants have greater bystander attitudes and behaviors when compared to white participants, while other studies have found that white participants report greater bystander attitudes when compared to Black participants. One thing to note, though, is that past research has been somewhat limited because the samples are usually majority white, cisgender, and heterosexual. And the notion that additionally, there's the notion that bystander intervention trainings are very white-centric and they're not designed for LGBTQ populations. And this has become more apparent recently.
Yeah, so we are hoping to spend some time talking about how race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation are addressed in bystander intervention programs. So if any of you are familiar with bystander programs and you want to weigh in on how you've witnessed that, that would be great. If you're not, that's okay. We can just talk from our experiences.
You know, hi everyone, this is August. I don't know how relevant the research that I have done is to the types of bystandership program in the GLBTQ community, but given the recent social events involving law enforcement, bystandership clearly plays a role in trying to reduce conflict and violence in our communities today. And I think the real issue is what limits people from becoming more actively involved in interfering with things that they see and they witness and they know that is wrong. They don't know what to do. And they look to the larger group, and if the larger group is not doing anything, they tend to emulate that. So some of the work done by social psychologist Irvin Staub he is specifically focused on bureaucracies and organizations involving law enforcement, creating mentorship programs where law enforcement officers feel safer to intervene and expose situations that they feel are contributing to violence. So I think providing more access to resources that teach people appropriate venues of intervention is probably one of the first steps.
Yeah, thanks for connecting that. I see some similar ideas there around, people being afraid to intervene, whether that's because of the organizational culture or, witnessing other people not doing anything. Those are also things that are talked about in the workshops that I've seen. And in addition, they do kind of present a wide array of strategies for how you could choose to intervene, ranging from more confrontational to more distracting, or turning up the music at the party or something like that that's not as direct confrontational, so that people can have a wide range of methods that fit what works best for them in that situation. So in our experience and at our university, I've been evaluating this since the beginning, and we found that students wanted more diverse examples in the role play scenarios that they were being given, where they're being asked to act out as bystanders. So they're given a scenario, it would talk about a couple of people, what was happening, and then they have to act as the bystander. And so in some of the qualitative feedback on the surveys, they would talk about the role play scenarios are too heteronormative, we need diversity around race, we need diversity around ethnicity, things like that. Which in some ways was a tiny bit surprising to us initially, because the program had used colorblind and gender neutral examples, right? So they hadn't ever ascribed people a gender, and they hadn't ascribed people a race or an ethnicity. But it appears that folks really wanted more about that in the data, and that for them this colorblind and gender blind scenario wasn't really working, and they needed more addressing of the diversity directly.
So, as we keep going on, if people have other thoughts about like how they either have or haven't seen this represented, like definitely continue to bring those up. We also wanted to talk about, why addressing issues of race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation directly, why that might be important, like why maybe this approach of trying to make it more neutral related to race and gender and sexual orientation like isn't always working for students. So we have some ideas, and if you all have other ways you think it's relevant, definitely feel free to share those. So one big one is just that, sexual assault happens to everyone. And there's different kinds of risk factors and barriers to, risk factors to being exposed to sexual assault, as well as barriers to receiving support for that based on different populations. So additional, levels of oppression, intersections of oppression make it very challenging for people to find support given, traditional narratives of power and what kind of victim people tend to sympathize with. There's also this issue of the unique nature of different kinds of bystander situations. So this sense of, you know, how comfortable do you feel intervening in different situations? So, you know, when we're thinking about if you are a Black man who is witnessing a potential sexual assault between two, like a white man and a white woman, how comfortable do you feel engaging with that situation given racial power dynamics? If you are a lesbian woman, how comfortable do you feel intervening with a cisgender heterosexual couple? Like, what are the dynamics that are at play there? Even when you're able to recognize those as issues, do you feel like that's your place? Do you feel like there might be problems with you doing that? So issues like that. Are there other kind of, so I'm wondering, can people see other kinds of ways that this might be relevant for bystander interventions, or other thoughts you have about this specific issue?
I can jump in, Lexi here. In the workshops that I've done in the past around consent and healthy masculinity, something that has come up when speaking in particularly to Black men is when discussing the rates of false allegations and the false allegations that are higher with respect to Black men. And so when thinking about, as you mentioned, the opportunities to intervene in a bystander setting, having a much higher potential of harm and risk associated with that, but it's also important in our discussions around false allegations to include that rhetoric and thinking about things like Emmett Till and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's such a crucial point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think both from the sense of, you know, a bystander who may be, you know, a Black bystander, as well as, you know, for example, a white bystander viewing a situation where, you know, two Black individuals could be connected, or like a Black individual and a white individual, trying to navigate your own biases, knowing these different, if you are aware of the, you know, very heavy and complicated history that's still continuing today, like how is that impacting your assumptions about who is a victim, who is a perpetrator, what is this situation, and your sense of, is it appropriate for you to intervene? I think that's definitely a good point in this other tension of, you know, racially and racism motivated false accusations.
For sure. And then I think about also like all the instances that have been publicized more broadly recently in terms of whiteness being weaponized, and whiteness has been weaponized forever. But thinking about like Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper and other instances like that, and how that influences our ability to be effective bystanders, and our responsibility to be bystanders in those situations, and how that pertains to gender-based violence and anti-Black racism as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Bystander kind of transcends a lot of different social issues, and that's another way we could be using it. It's when we're witnessing whiteness being weaponized. Yeah.
I think, not to keep bringing it back to law enforcement, but in the George Floyd incident, clearly that played a role, this asymmetrical power distribution based on race. Many of the actual witnesses that experienced it, they were actually telling the officers to release George Floyd were of minority. And I think because of that white privilege, if the ethnicity had been different, maybe some of the witnesses would have been more emboldened to proactively intervene. I don't know. But I think that asymmetrical power imbalance that we saw with race clearly played a factor in why there was a greater degree of bystander, a lack of intervention during that particular crime that had occurred.
I think that's a really good point. Like even if a Black man or a Black woman intervened in a situation, maybe they wouldn't be taken as seriously as if a white man or white woman intervened. That's a very good point.
And I think one thing to consider that within constructing interventions is how do you hold that tension that people might have that message in the back of their head, which may impact their motivation to try to intervene if they feel that this won't be taken seriously and I might actually become a target because of this. So these kinds of, very emotional and as well as political issues that, and the political is emotional, but these things that can be impacting people's willingness and safety.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge in bystanders. We talk about barriers to intervention and people having fears about this, but the fears aren't unfounded either, right? That for some folks, intervening in certain situations is in fact potentially a threat to their safety, and we need to be aware of that. I think these have all been really great comments, and I think they kind of go back to why some of our participants were talking about, we want to see more, we want to see race brought into the conversation, we want to see ethnicity brought into the conversation, we want to see sexual orientation and gender identity come into the conversation more, because they affect how I'm able to enter in as a bystander. And so I need to be talking about that. Another issue that we noticed in our team that I think is relevant in here, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with, if I'm honest, but inherently bystander intervention is about getting involved in other people's business, really. Like you see something that you're not directly involved in and you have to stand up and do something about it somehow. And so in a lot of ways, that's really a cultural value. That's a cultural assumption that is something we should be doing, and that's something that is okay to be doing. And so I think it's important to be aware of that, and that cultures may vary in how uncomfortable that is. I think in most cultures, there's a degree of discomfort about getting involved in other people's business, particularly when they're not people that are known to you. But I think how much that is taboo varies. And so I think that's another issue that probably warrants more consideration in bystander intervention.
How much of a role do you think toxic masculinity may have an impact on bystander effect and, men holding other men accountable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. A really big one. Yeah. So I think toxic masculinity norms really play into the perpetration of sexual violence. And that there's very strong research showing that when people engage in sexual violence or engage in even just talking about sexual violence in ways that condone it, that when people are silent around them, especially their male peers, that they assume that means those male peers support those beliefs. So especially in all male close-knit circles, like frats and athletic teams, actually becomes very risky, because even folks that don't share those beliefs often aren't acting as a bystander. They're not speaking up. And it perpetuates that toxic masculinity, because you're going, oh, my friends just agree with me, or otherwise they would have said something. So I think that's really important. And I could also assume that with toxic masculinity, that people would be less likely to recognize this scenario as problematic and therefore needing intervention. So I think there's probably a lot of ways that comes in. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up the same thing, how culture might play into this. For example, I believe Lexi brought up machismo in her presentation, and machismo, you're very this is my property, don't intervene kind of thing, or he's a male, he knows what he's doing. So I think, yeah, piggying back on what Tyler said, I think culture and just those norms are need to be taken into consideration, because how can we pose something in a way that they'll be able to understand it? Because if you come up to somebody who's machista and all of a sudden try to stop something, they're gonna get angry with you. So how can you word that conversation, or word what you're going to say, so it's not threatening to the person?
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, given the work that I've done in health and masculinity in the past, if I think about what you just said, Barbara, in terms of, if there's a situation where someone was more entrenched in machismo culture, it is much more dangerous for me to say something as a woman than it is for a man to say something. And it is even more helpful if that man belongs to a similar culture or background, right? And is able to relate to that person on a similar level, right? So that's when we talk about, male allyship and the potential for that. And that's why I started to focus more of my work on specifically working with men and seeing the great potential for change there. And to bring up Tyler's point more around toxic masculinity, and to be able to kind of call in or call out your friends. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that differentiation, but calling in is basically kind of taking someone to the side and talking to them in private, while calling out is making a more public statement, and both have their pros and cons and are good techniques to use. But the loudest voices in the room are the ones who are heard, right? So for example, I ran a workshop with the entire football team at the University of Waterloo, which was a whole thing. My workshops are supposed to max out at 30, and this was 100 people. So we had to spend 45 minutes talking about alcohol's role in consent, because that's what they were talking about. Right? And it was very problematic, and there was a lot of ignorant statements made, but it had to be unpacked. And so it was a very, I didn't feel very safe going to the washroom on break. It was very problematic. But it was the same collection of 10 men saying the same problematic things over and over again. But when we got the survey responses back, there was lots of men who had great things to say. And hey, we really appreciated the content. It was really helpful. We learned a lot. But they would never feel comfortable saying that to their playmates, the people they play with. Thank you. So what we now do is that they go to, we don't have an athletic specific workshop, they go to the academic workshops, and they kind of get spread out, and then they feel more comfortable talking about their feelings, et cetera, because they're not able to share that with their teammates. So just interesting to think about.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Megan.
I was going to say, I think that nicely maybe challenges or transition us into thinking about what do we think are some potential solutions and strategies for dealing with issues of diversity around race, culture, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation in these programs?
Yeah, so I'm just going to get us started with just a few to get us to start thinking about things, and I want people to jump in if they feel comfortable, either, turning off your mic, or if you feel more comfortable saying in the chat. But bringing in diverse experiences or examples is always a great idea, but being careful about how that's being done. So are you pointing to the, let's say, I don't know, case scenario, do you do a 100 football players, all who are cisgender men, and you have 3 women in the group? Are you going to ask the 3 women to talk about their experiences of gender-based violence? Are you, if there's only a couple of people who are people of color, are you putting them on the spot? So finding a way to talk about these issues without forcing disclosure or discussion from those communities. So trying to make it so that it's, it's worth it to make these things not necessarily neutral or oblivious to race, but how do you do that without forcing students of color to now bear a responsibility or a burden of discussing their own experiences of racism and racist sexual violence? So one thing is having the facilitator talk about these issues rather than the students. Another thing is considering where you're putting discussions of marginalized identities and oppressed identities. So one thing I always think about as a lesbian is when I see examples of same gender sexual violence in bystander situations, I'm never sure if I'm supposed to think that both of them are LGBTQ or just the perpetrator. And that brings up so much baggage, cultural baggage about predatory stereotypes and, all these kinds of things. So being thoughtful about that, is the only times you're putting in diversity is with the perpetrators, or are you also thinking about, marginalized victims and survivors? Because we do know that there are a lot of marginalized survivors. And so thinking about that kind of issue. So another thing, and this is kind of interesting given what Lexi brought up, is some homogeneous groups. So, it can be helpful to kind of have more general groups, but also thinking about, do you want to do an intervention just for students of color, just for Black students, just for Black American students, just for Black Caribbean students? So trying to think about, getting to some of those nuances, just because not everyone's the same, and some of these are unique cultural issues. And then another big one is just owning the limitations up front. So the majority of perpetrators are men. They're of different identities, and the majority of victims are women. How do we talk about diversity while also acknowledging those issues? And, acknowledging what the capacity of the intervention is and what it's not. And we think a big thing would be more qualitative work would be really beneficial on this subject to make sure that we can get more diverse samples and more nuanced perspectives. So I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to see what other ideas people have, or what are things they would like to have. I see one piece about bystander intervention being less likely to happen within authoritarian cultures, definitely a big piece. So how to navigate that. And then empathy training is a great point. So helping you to kind of empathize with different groups of people so that you're able to kind of, I think that's a great point, to be able to actually see someone as a victim and connect with them.
I have a question. I thought Lexi brought up a really interesting distinction between call in and call out.
Mm-hmm.
So when do you all think that either is best in what situations do you think either is best?
I can speak to that if anyone wants to. So it's very context specific. So I can't give you a for sure solution, but some of the best practices are if say, for example, if you're in a I don't want to make assumptions, but if I don't know if you identify as a man, but if you are in a group with a bunch of other men, and they say something problematic and sexist, and you are pretty sure that no one else has been harmed in that situation because there's no woman there, there's no femme there, there's no non-binary there, then to try to reduce shame on that individual and to try to increase capacity for change, that you bring your buddy to the side. You're like, hey Bob, just want to let you know that saying bitch even in that context wasn't cool. We want to have a conversation about it, et cetera, et cetera. While in contrast, if something was said in public and you are pretty sure that someone else could have been hurt in the room, it's really important to let your voice be heard, that you do not stand for it, so that person knows that someone's there who cares. And you can even have a follow-up conversation with that other person afterwards to explain more in depth, but then that way it is called out more broadly that this is not acceptable, and that person who potentially was harmed knows that they're not alone. So those are some of the best practices. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that was. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Lexi.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. But if you three would like to drop your contact information in the chat, if anybody would like to reach out to you. And yeah, thank you all for presenting. This was great. Some great discussions. And I think that these are such important discussions to have, and it's important to keep the dialogue moving forward. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So we will be having a 10-minute break. The next session will begin at 4 o'clock. We'll have something going on in this conference room and something going on in the second conference room if you guys want to go check either out. We do have that main room open for questions or for socializing. And yeah, so we'll get started in a little bit.
You mean 5 o'clock, not 4 o'clock.
Yeah, sorry.
Long day, I know.
I'm glad it's 5 though. All right.